Somewhere, a good distance away from the panic slowly dying down again, and the hectic rescue and crowd control operations of the security forces on board, a hatch in the ground, positioned out of the way and semi-discreetly hidden between decorations and utilities, opened, making way for a head to tentatively poke out of the ground, looking left to right, eyes and ears moving independently to scan the surroundings for possible dangers. The unappealingly bland surroundings of the GCS's administrative area, with its barren walls and cold colours, was unusually populated. Many people scurrying around in a hurry without paying much attention to their surroundings. Many seemed to be preoccupied with themselves, and so far, Shida couldn't see any security personnel near their exit. After a few seconds of carefully surveying the area, Shida decided that the air was clear enough, turning around and waving for the others to follow her, right before pushing herself out of the hole in the ground and straightening out her clothes, brushing her hands across her jacket to smooth out wrinkles and get rid of dust that had gathered within the maintenance tunnels. Can't believe that worked, she thought to herself, trying to half-heartedly hide behind a decorative plant positioned to the side of the hatch, and looking at the people agitatedly talking a small distance away from her. Whatever James had done, it had indeed managed to cause a big enough commotion for the security to be noticeably busy with containing it. She just hoped those shots they heard earlier had been all part of the plan. At the thought, she had to bite her lip, hard, to push the warriors out of her mind. She had let James go, again, and again she had to deal with what that entailed. Quietly she stood guard as the dark figure of Curie and the massive frame of the Turnip emerged from the hatch as well, before they closed it behind them again. She was also trying to decide whether or not it was a good thing that the current events had the streets a lot more populated than they should be around this part of the station. Maybe they could try to blend in, despite sticking out like a broken limb. People surrounding them would certainly make it harder to spot them. Inadvertently, she noticed her right arm tremble and quickly clenched down on it with her left hand, trying to stop the unwanted movement. "What do we do now?" Curie asked, copying Shida's attempt at remaining out of view for the moment, although they had little chance of actually succeeding in that. "We go on," the massive company answered confidently, before Shida could. Something about his calmness in a situation like this was unnerving, and that agitated Shida. However, she could not disagree with him. Giving her arm a last good squeeze and taking a deep breath before letting it go in the hopes she would have it under control now, she agreed. "Yes, just walk like there isn't anything going on. We're meant to be here and nothing is wrong." She tried to sound reassuring for the cyborg, however she couldn't even reassure herself. Close as a group, the three unlikely companions stepped out from their relative cover and confidently merged with the crowd, ignoring the passerby looking at them suspiciously, while also keeping an eye out for security or military personnel. It seemed to work. While everyone did give them a passing glance, sizing the strange group up, no one seemed to be all too concerned about doing anything more than that, instead going about their own business. Many still seemed rattled from previous events. Others were clearly family members or friends, either looking for someone who might have been wrapped up in the events, or currently comforting someone who they had already found. People lying in each other's arms, relieved crying and wailing, soft reassuring and gentle patting, others calling out to those they had not yet found or yelling in excitement once they finally saw who they were looking for. Shida nearly had a heart attack once someone very close to her yelled out, "Hey, stop, wait!" making her shoot around to what she thought was someone recognizing them, her hand shooting down to reach for her weapon. However, she managed to stop in time as she realized it was just a man right behind her that had called out to a woman a small distance away. She then watched him push his way through the crowd hurriedly and excitedly, while Shida, her heart still pounding all the way up into her throat, slowly removed her hand from her hip and tried to calm her nerves. Towards the walls of the station and surrounding buildings, people were sitting on the floor, letting their loved ones rest their head on them to take a break from the stress of the day. The sheer scale of the incident James had caused, and the impact it had on the people of the station, was only slowly becoming clear to Shida. Most likely he had recognized it before her, which would explain why he had been so downtrodden earlier. She should have said something, but what could she say? Banning the thoughts from her mind, Shida ripped her eyes away from the crowd for a moment, instead looking up at the giant who was trotting along next to her. "So, how do we get to your ship exactly?" she asked, studying his face. One of the man's piercing eyes shot down to look at her, while the others were in constant movement, not letting their surroundings out of their sight for a second. "If we're lucky," the plated titan finally replied after a moment of silent contemplation, his voice low and rumbly, "then maybe they haven't yet figured out how the dancer and I have been moving throughout the station. It is unlikely, but we should at least try, as it is by far the fastest way we have." Not feeling the need to hold eye contact any longer, Shida also went back to looking at the faces around them, turning her head away from the giant, saying, "Fine, lead the way." She wanted to get away from here. Maybe it was her nerves getting to her, but she could have sworn that some gazes from the people surrounding them started to last longer and become more intent. But they couldn't hurry. Sure, their steps were fast, and they pushed through the crowd at a steady pace, but they couldn't go so fast as to raise any alarms. They had to match the crowd's speed, as to not start to stick out and become an easy target for anyone trying to look for them. James's distraction might have worked well, but it wouldn't entirely protect them. She sincerely hoped it hadn't worked too well. She had to bite her lip once more, as the thought that they truly had no way of knowing whether he would be captured or not. He had sounded quite sure that he would be able to pull it off, but had that just been a facade? Him wanting to go alone wasn't exactly new, of course, but somehow he had seemed a bit different. Then again, he was probably worried more about everyone else's safety. He had said it himself. He was going because he was the one not being shot at. Anyone around him who he had to worry about that rule not applying to could have slowed him down severely. She would just have to trust him. No, she trusted him. He said he would open that door for them, and he would. He would open that door, and later catch up. Later. Her eyes fell onto a group of security personnel, their bright identifiers making them stick out of the crowd. They were casually but deliberately walking along the crowd, looking around and holding their weapons at the ready. Not aggressive in any way, just generally being there and providing a presence of authority, having an eye on things. Discreetly, she indicated towards them, and neither her nor the Tonasha side needed to say a word to know what the other was thinking. Trying to make it seem like a spontaneous decision without reason, they pushed their way slightly to the left in a way that would bring some of the crowd between themselves and the approaching guards once they would cross each other. Of course, they had to be careful not to make it obvious that they tried to avoid security. Still, even though she felt that they weren't behaving suspiciously enough for anyone to notice, Shida's paranoid Deathworld mind wasn't exactly made for remaining entirely relaxed, and each new look or quick glance some random civilian passing them gave her made her almost sure that those people had to be onto them and would surely bust them outright. Every time it happened, her nerves were stretched thinner and thinner. Soon the distance between their group and the encroaching guards had about halved, and a protective row that was about 2 people thick lay between them. Things were looking good. If they kept going like this, the two groups would miss each other no problem. They probably wouldn't even see each other at that point. Extremely on edge, and not wanting to see any more looks cast at her, Shida turned around for a moment to ensure for herself that Curie was actually still following them closely. She hadn't really doubted the fact, but it was a distraction she could justify to herself. Indeed, the cyborg was loyally scuttling after her, their red eyes looking up at Shida candidly once they noticed that she was looking towards them. She flashed a quick, nervous smile before turning back forward. Curie had not yet said anything about what had happened between the two of them before they had met back up with James. "After all, you dragged them into this," James had said. It was unfair. Curie had been a part of this long before she had been. However, it was clear what he had meant. He had expected, and was probably still expecting her, to look after the cyborg. That was the one thing he had held against her. Not her apparently taking orders from the matriarch. Not her possibly trying to convince him to take an easier path. Just that one thing, that she seemingly didn't look after Curie. Why? By now, the security and them were almost on one level, and she could only see hints of them through the crowd. A few more seconds of tension so strong that it electrified the air, and then it was over. The groups had passed each other without interacting. For the moment, danger had been averted. While she kept her gaze forward, her ears turned, following the direction of the guards to listen and make sure they would keep walking, but she couldn't imagine that they wouldn't. So, although it might have been the slightest bit prematurely, she took the tiniest breath of relief, letting the tension drop off of her. That had been a mistake. "Ah, there you are, wait up!" A loud, high voice suddenly pierced the air, too close for comfort. Although she had been fooled before, some deep, ingrained instinct made Shida sure that this time it was definitely her that was being addressed, and she couldn't stop herself in time. Spinning on the tip of her feet in a fluid motion, she shot around while simultaneously pulling her firearm from her hip, levying the dangerous weapon in the direction the voice had come from, while only peripherally noticing her surroundings' reactions to her actions. Curie seemed to freeze in place, while Conglor threw his large head around, his eyes wildly scanning the area. Around them, many people recoiled with exclamations and noises of surprise emerging loudly from their throats. However, none were as loud or recoiled as far as the enormous, dark and furry form right in front of Shida, who almost flew a few steps back with a surprised outcry, lifting her hands wide up in the air of surrender. "Shida, no, it is just me!" more loudly called out to her. losing control of her loud voice in fear for a moment as she spoke. Shida breathed heavily, a chemical stress cocktail being pumped through her veins a mile a minute by her furiously beating heart. Here, hair, ears and tail stood on end, and only slowly did her eyes catch up to her mind, transferring the important image of who she was pointing her weapon at to the forefront of her brain. "More?" she asked surprisingly, immediately letting her weapon sink back down and stumbling a step backwards, as if she had been hit by a large force from her front. Moore, who seemed just about as shaken as Shida felt, took a moment, still frozen in place with her arms raised and heavily breathing, before she leaned back forward and straightened up again, her arms dropping to her side. Yes, it is me," she confirmed again, between deep breaths, as the old lady was apparently also trying to calm her nerves. Shida took some deep breaths herself, deep in through her nose, and slowly out through her mouth. Then, once she had her nerves at least somewhat under control again, she snapped forward. "What are you doing here?" she hissed under her breath, yet no less sharp than usual. "Didn't James tell you to stay where it's safe?" However, she didn't have time to wait for an answer, because among the nervous whispering and murmuring of the surrounding people who had been scared out of their wits by a weapon suddenly being pulled, there now also was the sound of someone loudly making their way through the crowd right towards them. Apparently the team of security guards had not missed a good portion of the crowd suddenly bursting apart and calling out in fear right behind them. Great. Shida looked around at her companions, who seemed to be just about as stunned as her, as the guards loudly announced their approach and demanded to know what was happening. What should they do? Should they try to run? That could make things much worse. But if they stayed, what should they even say? Surely with tensions as high as they were, they could hardly talk their way out of it, even if it was just a misunderstanding. Looking at her companions' faces wasn't helping Shida in any way. She had to think fast to make a decision even faster. However, after looking at the intense face of Conglorch and the blankly staring mask of Curie, Shida also looked down at herself, and an idea formed in her head. The military had been activated. She was still wearing her uniform. Could that work? It was risky because the big question was just on how much had security been filled in so far. Hell, how much did their opposition even know at this time? If they knew too much, this could be the end right here. However, Shida decided that she would try it. She swelled her chest, throwing herself into her uniform with vigor, and as the guards who were just about to push themselves past the last gawking bystanders, she loudly announced, "You can't just scare me like that. Don't you know what's going on? There are dangerous people on the move. That's why we told you to stay where it's safe, and then you sneak up on me like that?" While Conglorch and Curie could just remain quiet and hopefully be alright, Shida really hoped Moore would catch on to what she was doing quickly enough. She had little confidence in the old lady's acting abilities. However, she played her cards right. She would just need her to play along and not ask any questions in order to bring this home. That was, if the security didn't get too suspicious before she could even try. At least it seemed that the realization that she was supposedly with the military started to sink in with some of the people surrounding them, and the general aura of fearfulness filling the air around them slowly died down. A military person drawing a gun was a much less concerning sight than somebody random doing the same thing, after all. I was just getting worried," Moore fortunately stammered, clearly taken aback by Shida's behaviour. The feline wasn't sure if Moore was catching on, however she didn't need much more out of her, so it was probably better to interrupt the old lady before she could say any more. "Don't worry about us, it's our job," Shida admonished her, while holstering her gun and securing it back at her hips. "It's yourself you should be worried about. We don't know if it's safe yet." Looking at Moore's big, dark eyes, Shida could see the questions burning behind them. However, she held them back, not letting her worry and curiosity get in the way of everyone's safety. Someone who Shida supposed to be the team leader of the security guards had by now arrived within the small bubble of people surrounding the strange display, and built herself up to her full height. The large theropod threw her head sideways, the beak-like snout glistening in the light, as the red eyes zeroed in on Shida, taking in her uniform, and with it the symbol of her rank. She apparently pondered her reaction for a moment, then she spoke up. "Is everything okay, Petty Officer?" she asked, with only a hint of suspicion in her voice. Either she was a great actor, or she had not yet been instructed to be on the lookout for a Miat in military garb. Hopefully it was the second option. Shida turned towards her respectfully. "Yes, everything's alright, Chief. Just got a bit of a fright there. My nerves getting to me," she admitted, which was technically the truth. The Chief's rigid eye rested on her for a moment before looking back and forth between her and Moore, finally coming to a hold on the large woman. "You know her?" she asked, the question clearly being addressed and Shida, and not the fur-clad giant currently fixed in her gaze. "Yes, we're all friends," Shida replied immediately, trying to keep her voice steady despite having trouble hearing her speak over her own pounding heart. "Come on, just take it and move along." Sheeda thought nervously, while eyeing up the large, sharp cedar. There's nothing to see here, and clearly you have somewhere to be. Suddenly the chief's head shot around again, staring down Sheeda with her red eye, and hectically asking, "What's wrong with your team?" Giving her twitching demeanour and her eyes shooting around Sheeda's companions, she was probably referring to Sheeda's undercompliment. Right, she needed to explain those away. Think, Sheeda, think. "We were in the middle of vacation when we got called in," she said, trying to force her voice to remain firm. "We came as soon as we could, since it seemed that all hands were needed, and they didn't really have time to grab anything. Now that things, at least in this area, have calmed down a bit and there's no immediate danger, we were going to get their identifiers and other equipment." That was believable, right? Also made them seem more dutiful. The theropod tilted her head around, and Sheeda could feel her hair start to stand back up, as anticipation sent electric currents through her body. Her eyes were staring into the rust-red one of the chief, behind whom the rest of the security team seemed to become more restless by the moment. After a moment, during which Sheeda was sure that one could have measured the tension in the air with a detector, the chief's head snapped back around to her team. "Alright, be safe and remain vigilant," she said, before turning and immediately making her way in the direction she had been going in, before being interrupted by Sheeda's outburst. Wordlessly, and apparently being used to her erratic behaviour, her team followed behind, throwing one last glance at the strange group as they left. This was also enough for the people around to start to get back to more important things, like looking around for their loved ones or trying to find out what had happened exactly. That way, the bubble that had formed around them slowly dispersed and turned back into the busy crowd from before. Sheeda turned towards Moore. "Come on, we'll take you along and get you back where you belong," she ordered casually, waving her hand to indicate for the large woman to come along, pretending to not be further bothered by that interaction, as her heartbeat slowly slowed down to healthier levels. Moore seemed to ponder the wisdom in doing so for a moment, before she ultimately decided that it was probably best to go along with them. Sheeda then took a second to survey the status of Curie and Conglorge. She had been especially surprised that she hadn't needed to remind Curie to stay quiet during that conversation once. She was almost proud of them in a way. Conglorge appeared to be just as stoic as he had been before, his demeanour not really having changed. What was that guy's deal? Whatever it was, she would have to find out later. For now, they kept a fast pace, only slightly slowed down by now taking more along, who had some problems keeping up with them if they went too fast. Only after they had quietly gone some good distance from the spot where the incident had taken place, did Sheeda slow her pace enough that she could have a conversation with the giant. "All right, I'm going to ask you again," she said, through clenched teeth. "What are you doing here?" Looking slightly begruntled about the tone Sheeda was taking with her, but still seemingly glad that they could finally acknowledge what was happening, Moore turned her large head to look down at the feline. "I already told you I was getting worried. That much was no lie," she avowed, whisper shouting the words to try and remain subtle. "Are you aware that this entire disaster has been all over the news? Do you honestly expect me to just stand by? I am just glad I found you among all this chaos." Sheeda's ear twitched, and she averted her eyes from the Raphaelite, looking at the way ahead instead. "I don't expect you to do anything. It's none of my business," she opined with a click of her tongue. "But James isn't going to be happy." And certainly he would expect her to make sure the old woman wasn't going to get herself hurt as well, she suddenly thought to herself, without saying as much aloud. Moore looked around the group in a mix of confusion and worry, her dark eyes eyeing everyone up, as if she expected to have just missed James so far. After having uselessly confirmed for herself that James wasn't anywhere in sight, she turned back to Sheeda. "Speaking of whom, I almost dare not ask, but where is James?" she asked, the certainty that the answer could not be anything good already sunken into her voice. Sheeda looked down to her feet, abashedly. Of course, he just had to go and ask. For a moment she could feel the urge to bare her teeth rise up inside her, but no, she was being unfair. Naturally, Moore would absolutely have to ask that, and in no world could she expect the old giant to be considerate of her own damn worries in a situation like this. She had to calm down. Pressing her lips together hard, Sheeda took a moment before she answered, making completely sure that she had her voice under control before she opened her mouth. James said he'd catch up. "He's going to open a way out of here for us," she said, and although her voice remained steady and composed, she couldn't bring herself to say it loudly, her voice just barely remaining above a whisper. "He went alone. Again." "And you let him do that?" Moore burst out, just about managing to not scream at Sheeda, but still loud enough to make some heads turn in their direction. And with that, despite trying to remain composed, Sheeda had suddenly reached her limit. It had been a long time coming, even before James had split from them. Again. But so far she had managed to keep it in, mostly by distracting herself with the task at hand. But now, the dam gave way. "I didn't have a choice, alright?" she exclaimed, shrieking around and glaring at Moore before she even knew what she was doing. He didn't give me... She didn't even know what she wanted to say, her tongue going faster than her mind, just trying to get anything of the storm brewing within her out of her head. She wasn't even sure who exactly she was trying to yell at. There were options. Moore just made for a convenient target at the moment. Naturally, her display had now poured many more eyes onto them, the people surrounding them looking on in a mixture of concern and surprise. Luckily for them, the given situation meant tensions were high enough that nobody was really all that surprised at someone cracking for a moment, and the attention remained restricted to curious and even pitiful glances. Many probably had their own assumption what might have happened to this stranger's friend for her to get so emotional, and didn't want to give her any more grievances. Moore looked down at Shada with a suppressed expression of horror. Truly, Shada had never been exactly friendly to the old lady. However, if memory served, this was the first time, or at least the first time since forever, that she showed any outright aggression towards the Raphaelite. She could feel it. Her eyes were wide, her tail swayed wildly, even her claws were involuntarily extended, and she breathed heavily as she stared at the much larger woman down. However, what surprised her, and also somewhat brought her back to the ground, was the fact that staggeringly, the herbivore was holding the eye contact. The big eyes Shada stared into did not try to look away, and although she was clearly uncomfortable, Moore didn't appear actually frightened. Fearful, yes, but not frightened. She wasn't scared of Shada in the slightest. It was merely the intensity that scared her. That and what it entailed. As Shada stood there, heavy breaths rocking her body, and stared up into those big, dark eyes, the burning inside her slowly simmered out, leaving nothing but embers and cold ashes, and darkness behind. She opened her mouth to speak again, however, as there was nothing just babbling out of her anymore. Not knowing what to say now caught up to her, and nothing escaped her lips. She just stared up at Moore with an open mouth, her glare changing to a woeful expression, one that didn't seem to leave the giant unscathed. Suddenly, out of her periphery, a large dark form started to push itself between her and Moore, breaking their line of sight. Confused, Shada's eyes shot to this new figure. It was Conglorch. "I will take it from here," he stated in a low rumble, two of his eyes fixating on Shada. "We should keep moving, so I will explain everything on the way." Presumably his other pair of eyes were looking at Moore on the other side of his head. Shada's first instinct was to protest. However, it quickly died down and she couldn't even justify to herself. If he wanted to explain, let him. Suddenly she took a step back, dropping the tension in her body and turning back in the direction they were heading. She tried to muster up the will to force her legs to move, but it took her a second. From behind, she felt a soft nudge. Turning her head lethargically, she looked at what had brought the unwanted contact. Back at her looked curious red eyes, emitting a soft glow. Their black, unmoving face was tilted candidly, as they held a single one of their backward legs outstretched to softly brush against her. The cyborg didn't say anything. It just looked at Shada with those big eyes. Yet somehow, it was enough. Releasing a quick breath through her nose, Shada pulled herself together and shook her head, making her hair fly wildly and wiping away her bleak headspace, if only for a moment. After keeping her eyes shut for just a moment, she took a deep breath and opened them up again, flashing Curie a quick smile. It was time to move along, one step at a time. "This is absolutely insane," Raprik yelled, a tremble in his voice, as he crouched down low, trying to hold on for dear life as the wind blew through his fur, and the station rocketed past them at massive speeds. "Just be glad we don't have to walk all the way," James replied, sitting cross-legged and leaning back, letting the wind blow past his face and relaxing with the first feeling of moving air he had gotten in a while. "Just stay away from the live wires and you'll be fine." "I would much rather walk," Raprik screamed back at him over the howling wind. James ignored the outburst, apathetically looking over his shoulder, down at the people below, some of which were looking up in awe as above them a train was shooting by in dizzying heights with two people sitting on top of it. James sporadically flexed his toes and relaxed them again, trying to get a minor but irritatingly lasting aching out of his legs during this moment of reprieve. For a moment he wondered what the driver of the train was thinking. Or his passengers. Surely some of them would have had to notice the people walking on top of the rails, or at least heard them board the cabin's roof. Despite his demeanour boiling down to not taking reprieve seriously, his mind didn't reflect that. He was past the point where he could allow himself to lose focus. Even now, he could see the station's response happening below him, security being intermittently placed along the railway to keep an eye on him, constantly controlling where he was going, and when he would come back into reach. They knew they had time. He couldn't remain up there forever, after all. He had to have a destination, so there was no point in risking climbing up to partake in the dangerous tightrope act themselves. For a moment, The two adversaries turned momentary travel companions were quiet, just letting time pass them by. Finally, Reprieve broke the silence again. "You know, I must admit you're surprising me," the warrant officer confessed, lifting his head ever so slightly from his huddled position to look at James. "Given past experiences, I expected you to keep fighting tooth and nail until everything came toppling down. So, I respect what you are doing here." James lifted an eyebrow at the man. "That's a human expression," he commented, the wind loudly racing past his ears, ignoring the rest of Reprieve's sentiment for a moment. Reprieve sneered his face and lifted his trunk into an approximation of his specious smile, and replied, "While I have a lot to do and little time, I'm not entirely idle in between assignments." James wanted to make a snarky remark. However, at exactly that moment, his leg decided that, despite him having flexed his foot for the last 5 minutes or so, he had suddenly done it wrong that time, as his scarf clearly announced an oncoming cramp with a foreboding feeling building up within it, causing James to, almost panic-stricken, stretch out his leg as hard as he could, as if to try and avoid the painful experience. To achieve this, he also had to let himself fall on his back. Reprieve looked onto him in confusion, while James just about managed to not cry out in pain while waiting out his muscles' rebellious phase. Finally, once the worst was over, he pushed himself back up, mostly taking his previous position, apart from still keeping his legs stretched out to the side. The conversation having been thoroughly interrupted, James rubbed his eyes, and before he knew it, a yawn escaped him. Only now that he was sitting, with a sudden surge of adrenaline unrelated to the general stress of the situation dying down, did he notice just how taxing the day had been? Taxing and long. Was it even still the same day? It couldn't be. How long had they been at this? His eyes wandered over at his shadow, who still seemed confused by his previous demeanour. Reprieve didn't look like he was tired at all. Exhausted, yes, but not tired. "Say, how come you're still so fresh?" James asked the rodent out of the blue. "I always thought human stamina was up there in the GC, but you seem like you outpaced me quite a bit." Reprieve tilted his head. "You're changing the subject," he replied dryly. "Humour me for a second," James gave back, jestingly waving his gun around non-threateningly. Reprieve wiggled his trunk in irritation, seemingly pondering whether he should oblige him. With a sign that expressed as much as, "What do I have to lose?" the man shook his head, his ears fluttering. "Your stamina isn't the problem, you're just tired," he related, in a matter-of-fact way. James looked back at him with a bemused expression. "And you aren't?" he asked doubtingly. Reprieve had to have been on his feet almost as long as he was. "Not in the way you are," Reprieve replied, and, seeing as he had not died yet, suddenly pushed himself up to get into a more comfortable position for a conversation. They had to shout over the strong winds anyway, so he might as well make it a bit easier to understand him. "My muscles are exhausted, yes, but I'm not in any need for sleep." James tilted his head. "Are the days on your planet that long?" he asked, his voice carrying over the wind. Reprieve again shook his head. "The ancestors of my people have all been hunted on large open plains," he shouted back. "Sleeping was often detrimental, so they evolved to not require actual sleep. Today our brain is still compartmented in a way that allows for parts of it to rest at a time, without the need to shut down completely. We can still sleep, and it is more effective, but we do not physically have to." James's eyes widened. "You're a dolphin!" he yelled, elatedly laughing for a moment before coming back down. "That is fascinating." That explained some things at least. Like it seemed that he was never asleep when he got called in because James was doing anything. Somehow, the subtle stalking he constantly endured for the rodent back on board of the ship seemed like a distant memory. Reprieve's eye narrowed, annoyed. "Would you take this seriously?" he asked, in an annoyed tone. "I am," James assured him. "That is just how my brain works sometimes." The rodent didn't look convinced. "In that case, would you care to get back to the topic at hand?" he less suggested and more demanded of James. "Just enjoying my last moments of being able to goof around," James mused, leaning back, letting the wind blow past him. "Once we go down there again, I won't be able to be nice anymore, and I'm worried about that." Reprieve snorted. "You could always make it easier on yourself," he said. "I'm sure we can pull some strings and get that door open for you. The result will be the same, and you won't have to stop being nice." James scrunched up his face in irritation. "So you think they would just let everyone else go, huh, smartass?" he asked annoyedly. He was losing his composure. "They're just leaf litter, nothing of importance. When we have you, they can go," Reprieve replied, a bit too casually. "You highly overestimate the danger they pose. It'll be your word against theirs, after all." James glared down at the rodent. "You seem to be under the impression that I'll be coming quietly. he said sternly. He refused to shout it, so he wasn't sure if the statement even reached Reprig, but he didn't really care. I have to say, I was wondering why you would make so little problems, even as we were surrounded by security. It seemed that Reprig heard him just fine, however. You've gone out of a lot of impossible situations, he related, with a confident aura radiating from him that James didn't like at all. But you're not foolish enough to think that you'll be getting out of this one as well. You may be crazy, but you aren't dumb. I just have to get you where you're going. If I try to speed things up unnecessarily, you might actually slip through our fingers again. James bit the inside of his cheek. If memory served, despite his usual pompous demeanour, this was the first time Reprig ever seemed to be actually assured of his victory. It was sickening. I said I would catch up with the others, James said, forcing emphasis inside his voice that he couldn't quite back up with force. And I intend to stick to that. But first, I'm getting them out of here, no matter what. Whatever you say, Reprig replied nonchalantly. I will just be doing my job in the meantime. James clenched his teeth. Damn, he hated that guy.